But hello, everyone. For those who couldn't hear my recording, at the top I said hello, I'm Letty Conrad. I'm coming to you today from my home office in Southern California. I'm a publishing and product development consultant to technology and content providers in professional and scholarly communications. I specialize in bringing human-centric R&D methodology to product development and program design, with the goal of delivering positive information experiences, building trust, and engaging with our user communities. I want to thank the organizers and everyone in Open Athens for the invitation and the ability to quick pivot. I'm really happy to be speaking to you today on this topic. And I want to just give a caveat that I approach this topic with the understanding that data are tools at our disposal. They are not magic wands meant to solve all of our problems. They are not anything except human constructions, essentially. Data-driven thinking is not an absolute, nor is it absolutely perfect in every instance. Again, it is a product of human construction. So with that caveat, next slide, I'll talk a bit about what I have planned for the next few minutes. Libraries, publishers, and our partners are increasingly putting data in the decision-making loop. And today I'd like to chat with you on this topic by looking at 5 themes or trends in how our industry is putting data into the work that we do to understand and interact with various online user communities. I'm sure there are others, so please, as your questions arise or as thoughts come to mind, please pop them in the chat and let me know what you're seeing from your vantage point. If you click forward, first I'd like to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is content discovery and access, and touch briefly on how new tools are allowing us to use data to serve new pathways in information-seeking journeys, and how we're coping with the last 12 months or so of disruptions to the typical research workflow. Next, I'd like to look at benchmarking. And by this, I mean setting some expectations and applying a layer of meaning on top of engagement metrics or usage metrics. I have some thoughts about how we might consider making sense of our data, especially around web analytics, and perhaps setting benchmarks around the personas, really bringing personas to life and matching what we'd like to do as far as interacting with our readers, authors, and others. Next, on a related point, I'd like to dive into identity management. Publishers and libraries don't always have aligned goals in this space, but I think it's important to acknowledge that we are all still struggling to identify exactly who our users are and what they're entitled to, let alone what they're trying to achieve and where they're headed. I'd like us to consider what our work might look like if we actually designed with users top of mind and built a strategy around information experiences rather than information transactions. This list wouldn't be complete without also next looking at discovery and inclusion, which you might be surprised to see here, but I want to underscore the wealth of valuable data available to our community to raise the bar in how we treat one another and how we address the underlying inequities of access in our industry. Finally, I'll wrap up with some thoughts about how we might up our game in applying data-driven thinking to our program development and our product life cycles. Next slide. The landscape of scholarly resource discovery and access continues to shift. In my 20 years in publishing, I've been surprised. What we mean when we are talking about discovery and access continues to change a bit, but especially at a time when the traditional big deal subscription models are being disrupted, and many institutions are offering the highest volume of distance learning programs in our lifetimes, or at least my lifetime. As I noted in the Scholarly Kitchen last August, libraries of all kinds are getting creative with alternatives to unbundle or break up the big deal. Faculty and librarians are working together to leverage data and find new ways to maintain access, to both offer alternatives to canceled subscriptions as well as meeting the needs of high volume off-campus users. We're seeing some new avenues open up as well from providers like Reprints Desk or Research Solutions. They're launching a new product this year that is essentially automating a solution to article level fulfillment rather than a mediated workflow through interlibrary loan. And I think that has some exciting possibilities. I'd suspect that we'll continue to see growth in those libraries with SAML-based authentication and publishers participating in programs like Seamless Access. We're also seeing increased needs to measure the demand for open access content, in particular because libraries' collection development questions, as well as publishers' business development questions, they're just simply different for open access than they are for traditional resources. So the data demands are different. Library stakeholders are asking if there are correlations between, say, a new open access filter added to the discovery layer and potential cost savings or time savings downstream for ILL departments. Publishers want to continue to probe the connectivity between OA readership and citation rates, among other impact factors. And we're all watching various funder bodies for their changing expectations and how we measure the impact of OA publications. With NISO Plus 21 fresh on my mind, I think we may be seeing an inflection point coming up when it comes to persistent identifiers for key elements in the scholarly communications workflow, from funders to institutions at the broad scale to research data bits and bytes, supplementary material kind of at the granular level. And what we see when we co-invest in standard identifiers is that some real magic starts to happen. The linkages are made and retained from funding grants to preprint to corrected versions of record and everything in between. And I want to take this opportunity to underscore the enduring importance of metadata for driving users to the information that they seek. For publishers, that's controlled vocabularies and conforming with metadata standards. Indexers and catalogers, are refining automated methods for metadata construction and taxonomy tagging. I recently got to see a demo of Anif, and I know that there are some other WYSI prototypes out there, for instance, coming out of the Carnegie Museum initiative around metadata tagging. But for libraries and publishers alike, we have to acknowledge that even in an age of AI and semantic analysis, and an age of Meta and UNO and many others, we are still struggling to get the basics right. That today's reality, plain and simple, is that metadata drives discovery. Discovery drives the library collection, and the collection is ultimately what drives users to publishers' assets. So metadata is still very important. Next slide. When I think about data-driven decisions, I think of benchmarking, as I mentioned, and it sounds really old school, but let me make a case for the simple function of setting localized expectations and organizational sense-making to your data. It's a matter of deriving actionable conclusions from the data that we have on hand based on what we're trying to achieve. Think back to the last time you downloaded your monthly usage reports. What did you look for first? What questions were you trying to answer? I can't tell you how many publishers I've worked with that have heaps of data, heaps of usage logs, and they're still not sure what good usage looks like. Between altmetrics, counter reports, and web analytics, it's easy for us all to feel a bit overwhelmed with the data. And oftentimes it acts as a bit more of a point of interest than it does actually as a business asset. So setting some of those old school benchmarks can keep us focused on the data that drives our business visions. And the same is true for in-house operational data. Every organization needs some sort of formula that allows us to make sense of it all. I think of examples like River Valley, which is working on a new suite of analytics tools with just that sort of operational data in mind. They are looking at ingesting a range of data types and allowing organizations to configure, in particular with publishers in mind, to configure that layer of meaning or benchmarking metrics based on what they're trying to achieve. and then adjusting those formulas based on what you're seeing from month to month, year on year, sort of thinking like a scientist and embracing experiments, experimental cycles of measurement and learning. It does take some practice, it does take some trial and error, but benchmarks can be a really important tool for communication and expectation setting across your organization. I think you'll find that it's really worth it if you're not working with benchmarks. The fact is, we're all competing with mainstream services that excel at positive personalized experiences. And I think there's opportunity for us to look at our data for indicators of how well we are engaging with readers and our stakeholders. I would encourage this industry to move our thinking toward engagement metrics over performance metrics, metrics that speak to human experience and the human practice of research and learning over information transaction metrics, downloads, page views, et cetera. Shifting our strategic sort of mentality toward listening for that human heartbeat in our data can empower developmental shifts and help us make micro adjustments in our products and services, allowing us to respond more quickly and potentially apply formulas that allow us to assess what we're learning from our communities of users and how they're using our services. Next up, whether it's publishers wanting to ensure effective access control or libraries looking to increase authentication security, we're all thinking a lot about how to best balance end user and institutional needs. In this last year, the pandemic pivot to remote work has made the pressure on authorization of users and authentication in institutional systems ever more pressing. As we consider how to best transform our technical infrastructure, I want to be here to advocate for a mindset shift away from the traditional approach of designing services for a generic transaction or a generic user experience and start thinking about designing for individualized information experiences, ones that build trust and ensure return visits. I think any hope we have of maintaining our current user engagement and developing new connections with users really requires this mindset shift. Essentially, an identity strategy is about leveraging specific data points that build up a picture of different users and then delivering personalized experiences by leveraging that data to optimize their return visits. This can establish a mutually beneficial relationship between an organization and their users. And I really understand the reticence towards some publishers' approach to users and personalizing registration. I think there are right ways and wrong ways of going about engaging with users. I think it's about valuing the time and the attention of those who visit our properties and offering them a fair exchange for their personal data. We're really past any era where we need to convince our users to share some basics about who they are and what they need. I think the data for service trade-off has been well established with most of our user communities. And I think it's time for libraries and publishers to embrace this era and think strategically about moving toward identity management. I want to be clear, however, I'm advocating for an identity strategy that's predicated on respect for privacy and user preferences for how their information is used and user preferences for how they wish to be communicated with. There is value to end users in reducing friction and increasing our chances to facilitate a smooth, efficient experience. So for publishers, we're better able to understand what users are doing and what they need. As I've talked about in the Scholarly Kitchen, publishers are increasingly taking up identity strategies as part of their initiatives to modernize access controls. For instance, I've seen BMJ doing some nice work around personalization. Emerald is also a great case study because their ambition is to build an experience platform rather than the traditional sort of, sort of generic service, as I mentioned earlier, that kind of puts the onus on users. LibLinks is another good case study. They've come in as a partner. I know they've worked with Emerald and others to use that data to support an engagement strategy. But for me, it's cases like this where we are developing an identity strategy that has profound organizational impacts and the market's perception of an organization. There are some easy steps that any publisher can take to start on that journey. It's not the sort of thing that anyone can build in a day, and I'm not trying to make it seem like it's easy. I encourage anyone with control over your organization's user experience to start with some simple steps to grow what you know about who they are based on your data, and to serve them a more personalized experience. It's easy for us to lose focus and get overwhelmed. It's much easier to take incremental steps toward developing an experience platform. Next slide. And I'm watching the time. I know we're a little bit tight. In practical terms, I just want to put out there that a platform with positive user experiences is also an accessible platform, one that ensures equity of accessibility to all readers, authors, librarians, editors, reviewers, everyone in our community. Those various stakeholders expect us to consider those with vision impairments, mobility or dexterity limitations, auditory considerations, language, and a host of other cognitive issues. If you need more convincing, I'm pleased to say that there are multiple benefits to be enjoyed with an accessible platform, in addition to avoiding lawsuits. Content, products, and services that are in conformance with accessibility guidelines are also vastly more discoverable and navigable. For example, videos with searchable transcripts and images with descriptive text, they're more readily found and used by everyone. This increases overall usage, as well as opening up opportunities to repurpose content across platforms and ensure readability on mobile devices. Of course, there are some key data types available to us, and that's part of why I wanted to bring this comment in. There are data types available to support accessible publishing and accessible product design. There are developer tools that you can plug in, that your coders can use and check for compliance live as they're creating their designs. There are diagnostic tools to quickly assess the compliance of a given product. Marketers can test how their web pages are received by those with vision impairments, for instance, by running Pericles by Firefox or any number of other text-to-speech apps. This kind of quick access to our data will point out where we have data missing. For instance, alt text missing from images or headers that are out of order. And I just want to underscore the W3C checklist and their guidelines include quite a few of tools and opportunities for you to make use of the data available to you. Next up, I want to zoom out and look at the big picture for a moment. In my line of R&D work, I have the opportunity to advocate for data being a regular part of our diet. I want to see data in the feedback loop that drives our recurrent cycles of program design and product enhancements. And it's not just statistical data. It doesn't have to be big data. It just needs to be relevant and be an accurate reflection of your user community and their experiences. Data that can be analyzed with a clear goal-based formula in mind for engagement and for achieving the type of experience you're looking to deliver. At the early stages of writing requirements, for instance, we can confirm our assumptions with data like surveys and testing early designs against our value proposition. This might be a broad-scale market research project. It could be competitive analysis done quarterly. It could be a targeted series of expert interviews. As we move into the prototype development and implementation phases for new designs, we can call on representative users to run through simulated experiences where hypothetical goals are presented and reactions are monitored, in light of our product ambitions and what we're trying to achieve. Finally, once a product design is live to the public, it's time to run automated A/B covariant testing to inform priorities. It's time to really put our usage reports and web analytics to work, where we can start to experiment with those metrics that allow us to achieve our vision for user engagement. If you move forward just one click, I do want to point out a data-driven product lifecycle like this relies on some degree of data literacy and research methodology. And perhaps a bit of creativity and bravery in our teams as well. But I want to encourage us that we all have data at our fingertips, and it's just a matter of, really picking those data points that apply to our vision and apply to those mission-driven benchmarks that I mentioned earlier. That brings me to my final thought, which is that this sort of data literacy and creativity should not be centralized necessarily within a single staff member. I know for many organizations that's the case, but I want to advocate that we can all look to the experts and up our data literacy game. This is the moment for us to get all hands on deck, to pool resources internally and externally. And so I want to encourage you to not forget about the data pros that are out there. I often look to researchers first. Data and Society is one of my favorites, just as an example. They have a great deal of material available on the social implications of technology, bias in social media, and other pertinent topics to this crowd. I like to look to AI developers. For instance, the Umbrella Analytics folks are using data to build a more welcoming, diverse, and representative workplace in our community. I would also look to experts that can teach us more about using data, in a smart way. The Data Literacy Project is one recommendation, helping us to sort of learn the language of data, if you will. But that brings my talk to a close. I appreciate your time and your patience, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts and catching up on, hopefully, the discussion in the forum.
Thank you ever so much, Letty, for pivoting to to a live presentation. You've got a real virtual round of applause. The Open Athens team has been IMing each other madly in the background. So thank you so much for doing that. Right. So just so everybody's clear, we're going to have a full 5 minutes for Q&A. So we are going to overrun on the scheduled timings, so we're not going to rush you on that. So here's a question already. So I think the personalization thing is really interesting. There could be a couple of questions on that. Many publishers start tracking their data at their front door. In the scholarly world, the user journey is across platforms. Are there initiatives that combine identity data across platforms to create the very best experience? Or would that, for example, happen at the discovery level, i.e. an LMS or ILM?
Yeah, that's a really great question. That was actually one of my very first research projects into the user journey, and that was partnering with an access vendor and a library, both of whom I will keep anonymous at this point. And we did put our data together and sort of, if we could aggregate this, what would it look like? Now, I have not, please, someone raise their hand and let me know if there is something out there. I have not seen really a wide scale initiative of that sort. So I would encourage every organization to find a partner and simply educate yourselves as far as you can see some inbound referral data, you can see some outbound journey data, but very, very slightly. If we put our journeys together, we may be able to pull a full picture together. Really great question.
Okay, and extending that theme, and just talking from personal experience as well here, partly, in that you said at one point, I'm paraphrasing you because I couldn't type fast enough, but we are past any era about convincing users about a service trade-off with regard to personalization, and it's time for libraries and publishers to embrace that. However, I know from having sat on exhibition stands at US events how strongly some US librarians feel about that and effectively see themselves as gatekeepers and protectors. And I got a reasonable grounding in the US Patriot Act, of which I was blissfully unaware prior to that. So what's that? So you're saying it's time to move on, but and my knowledge is admittedly 2 to 3 years old, especially since we can't travel recently. Sure. So where do you think the current balance is right now?
Yeah, no, I think the Patriot Act is still a very timely topic, and one certainly U.S. legislation has been trying to struggle with as far as social media and their reach in managing our mass communications, or what their responsibilities are in that respect. So I do understand that tension. I do also think that there is a midway. There isn't just break things and, ask for permission, later, or clean things up later, versus the absolute, traditional lockdown gatekeeper approach. I do think that there's a midway. In part, that is a matter of engaging directly with those communities that we do have access to. I think there are experiments that are going on now. I mentioned Emerald, I mentioned BMJ. There are a handful of experiments out there that are complying with those basic regional privacy issues, as well as institutional, regulations, but still managing to engage and establish a one-to-one relationship. It's partly a matter of shifting our minds in the business to business organization versus business to consumer. So I think that it's a matter of finding what sort of mid path works for each given institution or publisher.
Okay.
There are no easy compromises.
Well, really, and here's a take on that, where there might be one area of either friction or grease, depending on your perspective. When I hear user engagement as a goal of any online service, I become concerned that the service will prioritize time on their site over efficiency aligned with the user's goals and best interests. Can you describe how the push for user engagement can avoid that pitfall?
Yeah, I really wish publishers would rethink the assumption that our end goal needs to be time on site. I would much rather see publishers prioritizing being a pleasant stop in the journey, pleasant piece in the path, where we build frictionless experiences. We are inevitably building trust, and we will inevitably build return usage. So I would question the assumption that engagement means keeping someone locked in somehow. It's instead a matter of being part of a community, being part of that chain, the supply chain, if you will, that is valuing the time and attention of the users, and not the time metrics on my web analytics report.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Right. We are going to call a halt there. So, Letty, I want to thank you again for absolutely staying on the ball and running with the changing landscape of this
My
event.
pleasure.
So thanks again. So to everybody who's listening, if you jump out of this session, our commercial director, John Bentley, will be waiting for us in a minute or two for his closing remarks. So Letty, thanks again, and everybody else, thanks for your patience while we got through that. Thank you. Bye-bye.